Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. We got the full trio here tonight. We got Scott, and Michael has officially kind of settled in New Albany, and we are headed down south to hang out with Nico Martini, Texas whiskey entrepreneur of all types of things. He recently wrote a book called Texas Whiskey, and he is also the co-founder of Grayson Whiskey Company. Nico, thanks for joining us today.
Hey. Thanks, man. Thank you for having me. I appreciate getting the opportunity to talk to some Kentucky folks about a little Texas whiskey.
Yeah,
we're trying our best.
So, and I need to already correct myself because I saw whiskey, but it's bourbon whiskey. So we're going to be talking about Texas bourbon whiskey tonight because there's two, like there's both that is happening down there in the Lone Star State. So how are things going? This is just going to be a general question. Just how are things going in Texas right now? And, you know, how are you holding up as the summer heat kind of dissipates and, you know, the Dallas Cowboys get ready to disappoint again?
Well, I mean, we're used to that. I mean, the other team down here is the Texans, so it's not like it's going well at all in any capacity. And I'm a Longhorns fan, so throw that on the pile. So, you know.
Hey, just a bunch of people that get hyped up every year just to fail.
It's all kind of like rooting for the same team. They're all basically the same team. It's all of the unnecessary expectations and none of the conclusions.
Welcome to the SEC, though. By the way.
Yeah. That's gonna be a trip. It's been a very eventful summer with me and my college football buddies.
Yeah, if you can't see behind me,
those conversations. I
have my jersey, so that's I'm a big football fan. I'm super excited to welcome Texas and Oklahoma, but we know that I could probably spend the entire podcast talking about sports, and I know that, you know, from the conversations we had prior to this, you've now listened to a lot of sports talk radio, so I will not bore Scott because he does NASCAR, and that's about it.
Awesome.
I was kind of hoping to get into the sports conversation here. I would like to hear how a Texas fan thinks they're going to do in the SEC. It's a bold move to make that move over.
Well, honestly, man, the moment that I was a very, very, very small child when it existed, but I loved the Southwest Conference. I loved like the proximity of everything, and like everybody was close, and SMU and TCU and Rice and like all of these colleges, but we're all in one spot. And, you know, it was very like, I loved the locality thing. And then when the Big 12 happened, that makes a lot of sense. Bring in Oklahoma, blah, blah, blah. Arkansas goes away, but whatever. And like, you know, that kind of thing. But the college football in general has changed so much. And now the reasons for proximity that when this whole thing started, 100 years ago, it's no longer viable. And the fact is, you can play anybody whenever you want the next day. Within 3 hours, you can be wherever you need to go play football. So it's not like you have to take a train for 3 days to get to, Pittsburgh to go play Pitt. It doesn't work that way anymore. You can go wherever you need to. And so the proximity thing is less important. But, all of my friends went to TCU or Baylor or Texas Tech or that kind of thing. And just kind of, when I first heard about it, I was annoyed, frankly. I was very annoyed that it was like, okay, great. We're already the school that's trying to destroy the Big 12 because of money. And like, okay, now we're really destroying the Big 12 because of money and whatever. But the moment that I knew this was the right decision for the University of Texas was when our AD got pulled in front of the Texas state legislature, basically so that anybody who was not from Texas, from in the Austin area, had a chance to kind of let it be known that they were very disappointed that this was happening. And I forget who she was, but one of the representatives from Waco literally said, well, now Baylor's not going to be able to build the basketball stadium that we were going to. And at that moment, I was like, yeah, why are we giving anybody else a bunch? Like, this is insane. Why did we fund y'all's stadium like, this is ridiculous. Of course, this is the right move. Of course, this is the way that it should go down. I look forward to being in the SEC. I hope that Sarkisian is good. It felt okay after the first game. I guess we'll see what happens. But like, it's I'm other than wanting to, I kind of wanted the Pac-10 or the Pac-12 thing to happen, just because I'm way more interested in going to games in Berkeley than, with all due respect, going to games in Gainesville or Tuscaloosa. Even though that'll be fun, but
But you get to come to this great state of Kentucky and drink bourbon whiskey.
That is true, and I've already told my wife that okay, as far as road games go, we're going to Kentucky, we're going to Vanderbilt. Those are the big ones that we're going to go to, because those are the towns that I'm very interested in going to.
Yeah, I mean, nothing like, you can go to Knoxville.
Looking like a true whiskey enthusiast there.
Yeah, you can't.
It's like you wrote a book on this stuff or something.
It is kind of like you wrote a book on this, but we'll see how good his knowledge is of the Kentucky and Tennessee whiskey scene. We had this question at work the other day, and it was the question was what state produces the most whiskey, and there was Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. So we had all these people.
Tennessee.
50% or 60% said Tennessee, and like the majority of the people picked Georgia for some reason. I was very confused on what we were doing. And my boss called me. I was like, we need to educate people on whiskey. I was like, can I do that as a job? And how like we as a company live in the bourbon capital of the world? Because that'd be amazing. I would quit my job today to do that. But neither here nor there.
Yeah. Absolutely. I do chuckle every time that somebody likes to say that Kentucky makes 95% of all of bourbon. That's really amusing.
No.
And still out there.
That is a common misconception.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good bourbon made outside of that. There's a lot of brands that just go on up to Lawrenceburg and grab their stuff from Indiana.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's get into some Texas whiskey, right? So tell us a little bit about how you got engaged with, your own brand and just this love for Texas bourbon whiskey.
So I'd say probably 10 years ago, we were sort of talking about this earlier. I come from a theater background, and my brother-in-law, he runs a blog called Cocktail Enthusiasts. And at some point he was like, hey man, how do I make my blog more popular? And it was March, and I was watching a lot of basketball. And I was like, dude, you should just do a bracket. Like, here's the best bartender in Dallas, and you have to come to your site and vote. And all you're looking for is hits. So you have to go to your site and vote. And there you go, get your hits up. And just do like a best bartender bracket. It's like, okay, cool. I'm like, you know what? I kind of like this idea. It exploded into a full-on TV pilot. And I started calling in all of my filmmaker friends, and we full on. I got my buddy who was on he was on a show on ABC at the time. He agreed to be the host. We got a couple of like big time bartenders from Vegas who were going to be the guest judges, along with my brother-in-law, and shot this whole thing. And before that, I didn't know anything about spirits at all. And he kind of got me into the cocktail thing, and it sort of kept going. We very quickly kind of figured out that we were not going to sell it. Nobody was going to talk about spirits on television 10 years ago. But it was still, I was kind of falling in love with the cocktail thing. And so I wound up, my business partner on that project, we wound up starting a company called Bar Draft. We do draft ready cocktail mixers. We're still around. So we kind of started doing the cocktail thing. Sort of through that, I had this random opportunity to do a TED Talk. And so I've got a TED Talk out there about cocktails. I was approached by the San Antonio Cocktail Conference. I became the director of industry outreach, which basically just meant, hey, you're traveling around talking to people. Can you talk to them about our conference too? And I said, sure. And so just kind of dove headfirst into the cocktail thing. And Cider Mill Press, who was the same publishing company as did the Texas Whiskey book, they approached me about 4 years ago, and they said, hey, so we have a book called Texas Cocktails that is going to be written. Would you like to write it? And I kind of looked at my schedule. I was like, you know what? Yeah, sure. Let's do this. And I just had a kid. I'm immediately thinking about like, man, this is like legacy stuff right here. Like, oh, look at Granddad's old cocktail book. This is gonna be great. And so I wrote the cocktail book. And then fast forward, because of the cocktail book, I sort of ended up having a bunch of conversations. I wound up meeting my business partners on Grayson. It's you guys baseball fans at all?
A little bit.
So Vernon Wells, who former Yankee, Blue Jay, Angel great. He's my main business partner on the whiskey, along with his partner Brandon, and they wanted to make a Texas whiskey. And so we had a meeting and they told me what their plan was. And I kind of said, okay, well, that's kind of boring. Why don't you do it a little bit more interesting? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, man, anybody can source a whiskey and slap a label on it and call it theirs. If you want to do something cool, then why don't you start thinking about ways to do it in a more interesting way? And the thing that I could not get out of my head was I wanted to work with as many distillers as possible, as opposed to just one. And so it became a blend. And so it is Grayson Texas blended bourbon. We are working with Iron Root, Balcones, and Lone Elm. And the reason that it is not a straight bourbon is that Lone Elm is actually a wheat whiskey. And so 15% of it's a wheat whiskey. So we called it a blended bourbon. The reason that it's not called a blend of straight whiskeys is because I understood marketing and I wanted the word bourbon on the label. So that's why we called it a blended bourbon. And yeah, it launched in March. And I could not have scripted what happened with the launch of this thing. I mean, the reason that we call it Grayson is it means a very large chunk of the whiskey in it comes from Grayson County. So we kept driving by this sign. So I'm sure that's part of the reason why it was top of mind. But Grayson literally means son of the gray one. And we were very, very much of the belief that our whiskey could not exist without all of the work that those three distilleries have done leading up to this. They all have their own fans. They all have their own advocates. And their successes were the reasons that this thing went so well. We made 300 cases, 150 of them stayed at the distillery, and we did an online pre-sale. 150 of them went into distribution. The 150 that were at the distillery, we sold out in less than 2 hours. The 150 that went into distribution, after we sold out in less than 2 hours, everybody started hunting it. So it was gone basically within about 10 days.
Is that like because there's such a following down in Texas, or was it more broadly spread?
One of our major partners is Iron Root, and Iron Root had just won in 2020. They won Whiskeys of the World, Best Bourbon of the World. They had just became Icon of Whiskey. They had won Craft Distillery, blah blah blah. They're just incredibly accoladed. And they were our main partner on the thing, and everybody kind of knew that. And so kind of riding on their notoriety along with the fact that there's plenty of people who absolutely love Lone Elm and absolutely love Balcones. And there was a whiskey club event the weekend before we were doing our launch. They had a whiskey club event. It was and it was a perfect storm. It was ridiculous. It was kind of the first thing post-COVID, which doesn't mean anything anymore, but it was the first thing post-COVID, and there were 300 people there. Robert called me up and he was like, hey man, do you want me to let them taste Grayson? And I was like, yeah, sure. He's like, cool. Well, when they say, Robert, I don't want to come back in 2 weeks, I just want to buy the bottle now. Can I just buy the bottle now? Do you want me to sell it to them? I said, yeah, go ahead. There were 300 people there. They sold 220 bottles that day. And then it was this Facebook group. Everybody who had it went home to their computer and just blew it up. And they were just like, oh my God, it's so good. You got to try this, blah, blah, blah. And then Tuesday, we do the online launch. Less than 2 hours, it's gone. And now we have this beautiful combination of a whole bunch of people that forgot to buy it when they were up there, told all of their friends that they were really into it. All of the whiskey's gone in less than 2 hours. And now it'll be in liquor stores in about a week. And then everyone's just like chomping at the bit for this to happen. And then it just kind of vanished. So we have another run coming out in October. And then the idea behind it is we are sort of positioning ourselves as a celebration of Texas whiskey. We have 3 distilleries in this one. When we do batch 2, which will be in March, we will have 4 distilleries in there. When we do batch 3, Lord knows, we don't even know yet. But it's basically, it's always going to be blended. It's always going to be incorporating these different distilleries and kind of finding this sort of representation of all things Texas whiskey, if at all possible.
Nice.
Cool. So yeah. Can you kind of talk to us? Like, obviously, as we talked a little bit before this podcast, we're from Kentucky and don't have a rich background in Texas whiskey. Is that, kind of tell us about the scene down there in Texas? Is that something that's taken off with your like drinkers down there, I guess?
Yeah, totally. So sorry, I didn't even get into the book thing. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, when like everything is crashing and burning, I called my publisher and was like, hey man, you need to let me write a book about Texas whiskey. And he goes, you're not going to believe me, but on my to-do list is to ask you if you would like to write a book about Texas whiskey. And I said, yeah, like right now, absolutely right now. And so all of the pandemic things are happening, but like I have a book to write. So I had to kind of laser focus in. It totally saved my mental health in the midst of a pandemic. Like it was the best thing that could have possibly happened to me. And it really gave me an opportunity to dive into this Texas whiskey scene, which I was familiar with, but I didn't really know what the stories were and kind of where everybody was coming from. We've been making whiskey in Texas for 14 years. Man, it's been
not a long time.
No. And there was not a lot of history right here. When it all first started, basically nobody knew if it was going to work. Like this was not, we had no idea if this was actually going to work. And, it all kind of, Dan Garrison likes to tell this story about how he was meeting with, good Lord, insert all famous Kentucky distillers here. He was meeting with all of these people talking about how they make whiskey and where and he likes to talk about, oh, well, the honey barrels, they're all in the hottest part of the rick houses. So I knew that it was going to be, if the whole damn rick house is real hot, then it's going to be fine. So it's like, okay, cool. But you still had no idea if it was actually going to work. So, it was straight up. Texas whiskey in general was a complete leap of faith. And thankfully it wound up working out. There was a lot of trial and error. There's still a lot of trial and error. I mean, frankly, I don't know if people in Texas really know what Texas with quote unquote Texas whiskey will be 25 years in. We're 14 in now. So Lord knows what it'll be in, 30 years. But there's a really great, obviously just being in America, the first natural instinct is to make bourbon. And so Dan started making bourbon. Several people, when they kind of started making bourbon, but then we've got a lot of single malt down here that's doing really, really well. And there's like Balcony and Jared Hempstead is one of the founders of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, trying to make this thing a TTB certified distinction, and kind of give people a way to recognize what American single malt is in the grand scheme of whiskey. And not necessarily limited to bourbon. I mean, we've got wheat whiskey down here. We got people making whiskey out of Trulicale. We got people making whiskey out of rice.
So when are we getting the Texas oil-filled whiskey, or the Texas oil rig whiskey that is aged at sea? When's Jerry Jones coming out with his brand?
Put it on an oil rig? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, put it on an oil rig. Jefferson's got aged at sea. You got aged at oil rig.
As long as you're not distilling it at sea, I guess.
Hey, I'm just saying.
They still do.
Yeah.
There's all types of oil plays there that no one's really played up yet.
So I guess I'm kind of interested in kind of the origin story of Texas whiskey. I know that there's some controversy maybe over who was the first, or who was the first one to distill or bottle, and it was kind of a two-person arms race.
So the origins of Texas whiskey. So basically, the way that I put it in the book was Dan Garrison was the first person in Texas to distill whiskey. Chip Tate from Balcones was the first person in Texas to sell whiskey. Chip got a hold of the TTB bylaws and realized that, well, hell, I only have to age this thing 3 months and I can still call it whiskey. So he took some corn and aged it for 3 months, and he got a liquor store to sell a bottle, and voila, Balcones is the first Texas whiskey. And Dan was like, no, dude, he wanted to come out with the straight. He wanted to come out with the straight whiskey. And so Chip Tate is no longer at Balcones. And the way that I talk about it in the book is, if you would like to know more about the relationship between Chip and the rest of the Balcones crew, you are more than welcome to type in the words Chip Tate lawsuit into Google, and you will find whatever you want to know about what happened between Chip and Balcones. And it's still going on, man. He's still down there. He's been making whiskey for a few years, even though he hasn't really made anything. He's been building stills, which I will commend him. He managed to find a way to get other people to fund his R&D on his stills. So he made a few people some stills that he got into a bunch of metal work, and the stills are great, and he's got them. I just don't think he's actually run anything through it yet. So when the divorce happened, as a whiskey fan, I was kind of like, okay, well, Chip knows what he's doing. Balcones knows what he's doing. That just means we're going to have more. It's going to be more better options. It's going to be cool. Hopefully that'll be the case as soon as Chip starts making more whiskey.
Well, Nico, we have a surprise guest on tonight's podcast. Scott, you want to go ahead and bring in Chip?
Hello,
introduce Chip. Well, it is funny because I've got a bottle of Balcones sitting here, the Lineage Texas single malt, and it does have it proud and loud at the bottom, the original Texas whiskey.
And they are not lying.
Nico,
are technically not lying.
Nico, are all the Texas whiskeys this dark? I've noticed that with a couple of Texas whiskeys I've tried. The color is really dark on.
So what happens in Texas is the amount of interaction between the actual wood and the whiskey is just accelerated exponentially because of the climate and because of the swings here. When in the middle of the pandemic, when this really kind of hit home, I was working on the book, and in the middle of the pandemic, me and my family we drove to Colorado. And so the way that you drive to Colorado from Dallas is you end up going through Amarillo, and there's this place called Paladuro Canyon just outside of Amarillo. And when we went up there, it's a beautiful canyon. We go down to the canyon. We were in the canyon. In the bottom of the canyon. It was 115 degrees that day. And I know from remembering weather as a child that I've seen Amarillo, Texas at -10 degrees. Like, I remember that on lots of weather maps that, on the 10 o'clock news. And it just hit me that, good God Almighty, there are places in Texas that literally have 125 degree swings within the course of a year. And so, no, you don't age whiskey faster in Texas, but man, can you put yourself in a position to have a greater wood interaction? And it ends up causing so much volatility to it that you're going to end up with darker stuff. The other thing is, when people started making whiskey here, a lot of people were experimenting with small barrels. And so just, it's the nature of the thing, and they're trying to not make vodka, but still have something to sell and that kind of thing. And so there's I had some 7-year-old Lone Elm the other day that I know they were in 15-gallon barrels. When you put a whiskey in Texas in a 15-gallon barrel and leave it there for 7 years, it just looked like motor oil. It's so ridiculous.
Wow.
Dark.
Yeah.
And so, the thing is, it's the greatest thing about Texas whiskey is the fact that we don't have any history, and that we're literally just making crap up and figuring it out. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, then scrap it, go to something else. And everything, it just sort of feels like there's we were kind of talking about this earlier, but the Texas whiskey does not taste like Kentucky or Tennessee bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
It does not. We cannot make it do that. And there's this thing down here called the Kentucky thing. And it's basically the idea that if you like whiskey at all, and you are American, you started drinking Kentucky bourbon. That's just what it was. And now if you're into whiskey, now maybe you're experimenting with other stuff, blah, blah, blah. Texas whiskey's kind of been around. It's almost been around long enough that you've got some people that were introduced to whiskey via Texas whiskey. But I mean, for the most part, if you like whiskey, you started drinking Kentucky bourbon. And now it's almost like, it was almost like when everybody had to relearn what the hell rye was. And everybody had to be taught, like, no, this is a history and this is a thing. And no, it's not bourbon, but it's kind of like, but it's whiskey, but it's not bourbon. And like the whole education piece, it's the same thing down here. And it's like, it's just a different flavor profile. There's much different things happening to it down here.
So I have two questions. There's a nerdy question. Actually, both of them are kind of nerdy. So the first question I have is, there's a lot of topography and a lot of different geography in Texas, right? You have hills and valleys, and, depending on where you are, you can get some pretty high elevations or you can get some pretty low elevations. When you think about, like, if Nico, I know you have your own brand, right? If Nico was to build a distillery, what part, and you break it down in your book, different regions of Texas, right? Like, where would you want to, like, hone in on building out your still and all of that to get what you would think the best Texas whiskey or Texas bourbon whiskey flavor profile?
I think my answer changed about a month ago. Before about a month ago, I think I probably would have said something along the lines of, I don't know, somewhere kind of in the middle. So you're sort of hitting everything. I think now my answer is Marfa because it is bone dry, but it gets cold at night, and it's one of the only places in Texas that it could be the middle of the summer and it's going to get down to 52, and that's not necessarily that doesn't happen in the hill country. That doesn't happen in Texas like that, and it's a little bit more consistent. So I mean, like, frankly, the place that I think is going to make some of the most interesting whiskey is when you get into like hard West Texas. There's a new distillery in El Paso. I don't know if it's not quite desert enough for this, but it's going to be a very different kind of experience. The stuff in West Texas, I think it's going to be very interesting. I'm waiting on, and I have every intention of doing this. I don't know who's going to do it for me, but I would really, really like to get 10 barrels of new make and stick 2 barrels on the Gulf Coast and stick 2 barrels in the Hill Country and stick 2 barrels in West Texas and 2 barrels in the Panhandle and 2 barrels in North Texas. And literally, like, let's find out, man. Like, just let's leave it in there for the same amount of time and let's actually see what the terroir of Texas would actually do when you are looking at the exact same thing at the exact same time. There's a lot of one of the. Are you guys familiar with the Terroir of Whiskey by Rob Arnold? Yeah. So Rob's a master distiller over at TX Whiskey. It's a whole other story. But Rob is one of the biggest brains that I've ever seen in whiskey. He just got his doctorate in, I don't know, agriculture stuff. And his entire dissertation was basically talking about like just the terroir of whiskey and how it actually matters and where these heirloom corns are coming from. That's the other thing about like the differences between Kentucky bourbon and Texas whiskey is, man, everything down here is made with heirloom corn. Like everything. We're using weird ass blue hoppy, different white corns. Like we're very, very cognizant of the different types of corn. And I mean, I think that kind of comes from the fact that we used to be Mexico, where the corn comes from. And so there's just so many different varieties that grow so well down here. And, you know, we kind of lean into that big time when we're talking about bourbon, frankly.
Yeah. I guess this is the ultimate question as a fan of Texas whiskey. If you were to distill new make and place that, those 2 barrels in all the different regions, what still would that come from? Probably either still Austin or Gulf Coast, because they're making enough that I could talk them out of the barrel. Because they'd be the cheaper ones.
Yeah, they're the ones that are really precious about it. Everybody else.
So I think that leads me into my next kind of nerdy question, right? We talked about this prior too, but I feel people would be really interested in this. In Kentucky, we're used to these giant column stills, right? mass producing liquid, Barton puts down a barrel every second roughly, or a barrel like every second and a half. So, and like I made the comment to you, I liked Still Austin, and you go, well, that makes a lot of sense. They have the largest column still in Texas. So talk to us a little bit about the hybrid, the pot still versus the column still, and are people starting to think about going straight column? Like, how does that like stand up in the history of those 14 years and people maybe evolutionizing how they produce the whiskey in their bourbon that they're looking at?
So the majority of the whiskey down here is made in pot stills, and I think a lot of that is kind of because we didn't know if it would work. Frankly, you can, if you're going to put the money into a massive column still, you better be damn sure that this is going to work. So, because it's a completely different thing than, a 150 gallon pot still. You can do those on an experimental level, but like the large column stills, you better have an idea of what's going on. So it makes a lot of sense to me that the massive column stills that are now in place at Still Austin, at TX Whiskey, at Gulf Coast Distillers, they just did not exist until it was basically proven that the whiskey thing is actually going to work down here. You didn't have enough. There was not enough. There was not somebody crazy enough with their collateral, their investment money to put something in that and take that kind of risk until it was actually a proven thing. And so the majority of the whiskey down here is made in pot stills. I think, as far as like projecting out, I think that the best bourbon in Texas is probably eventually going to be made in column stills because it's just more stripped down. It's just a little bit cleaner, and it's not as, there's so many variables that you have to deal with when you're making whiskey down here, starting from the freaking heirloom corn and then going straight into the weather. But there's so many variables that it seems to me like the ones who are going to end up winning 20 years from now are going to be the ones who start off with a product that's a little bit more simple going into the barrel and then letting the barrel do the majority of the work, as opposed to starting off with something that's a pot still that's just uber flavorful and just there's so much more going on in a pot still bourbon than there is a column still bourbon. And you're throwing, like, you're starting off with a canvas that's already got stuff on it as opposed to a blank slate. And so I think that,
it's not an exact science,
there's a lot to be said about this.
It's not an exact science because the cut could be different every time and depending on who's working the still. And I think there's nuances to it. And that's why I like pot still, like Scott, this is a Scott phrase. It's got some funk, right? Pot still's got some funkiness to it every time. And they're all just a little bit different. And I think that's really interesting about, waiting to see if it would work, because you have some heavy hitting names out of Texas. Like, people fangirl over Garrison Brothers and people fangirl over Balcones, and, a lot of fans popping up about Still Austin and some other things like that. So it's interesting to see that they have it. Still Austin, obviously, but like, why hasn't Balcones just been like, you know what, we're going all in? Or Garrison Brothers saying, hey, we're going to go on and we're going to make more whiskey, because that's what people are demanding. Do you think there's going to be an evolution where those older, more established distilleries say, you know what, it's time to jump full feet? Or they, say, hey, this is what our fans love, we're going to continue to produce pot still whiskey?
I mean, I feel like, I don't think Balcones they make single malt. And I mean, I think that's their heritage, and that's what they're going to be known as. And they make single malt, and they make a little bourbon, but they make single malt. And it makes all the sense in the world that their stills are massive, and these massive, beautiful combination pot stills, because they make single malt. Garrison, who knows? Dan's kind of a wild card in general. Who knows what that guy's gonna do? But I do think that you will see whiskeys in the not too distant future that are more based on the idea of higher yields, making more of it, kind of leaning into, it's basically like the concepts have been proven. I know we've only been making it for 14 years, but now, it's sort of like, yeah, you can totally make whiskey in Texas. It's no longer this unknown. And so because of that, I think you're going to see a lot more people investigate it. I mean, like you've already got, who was it? I forget the name of the company, but somebody bought a big European producer bought Yellow Rose. Pernod Ricard bought TX whiskey. Balcones has a big like relationship with Diageo. Mahalo went into Treaty Oak. Still Austin. I swear Still Austin's gonna end up being sold to somebody soon, just because that sort of seems like what they're trying to do. And it's like you've got massive global entities that are going to be coming into Texas and making a lot of whiskey, and they don't deal with small pot stills. And so I think you'll see something change pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I love stills. I think they're really interesting. Seeing some of the old ones be restored, or like Scott and I when we went to Barton. Like the thing is just ginormous. Like it just makes you look like a tiny human. Like I'm like 6'4", and that thing is taller than I am. Like it's wider than I am tall. Like that's insane to me. So we've nerded out about how the whiskey's made and in the history of Texas whiskey. Now let's venture down this Grayson bourbon whiskey that we have in front of us that is made of 3 distillers. We were talking about this, just about like the flavors. There's a lot of complexity, I think. And don't do what I did. I just went for the big sniff. Bad idea. That singes the nostril hairs just a tad bit. But if you get a lot of my big note was like it's syrupy. It's like a lot of sweet sugarness to it. And then, I'll let the guys talk about what they did. But that was the one note that like kind of punched me in the nostrils, was big syrup, like stickiness note to it. That I really, it stood out to me, and I like that. So Scott and Michael, what did you think about the first impression off the nose?
I get a lot of like melted caramel, but then also I get almost like it's like fresh roasted coffee beans, like where you grind up a bunch of coffee beans, and it's got like that smoky, earthy, just there's a lot of complexity on the nose alone. Not even talking about when we get to the palate, but melted caramel was pretty much across the board for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not much of a noser, but definitely really rich, really sweet, almost like a candy, aroma to it. But I don't know, man. I like we were talking earlier, like I tried Balcones. I think that I may have had another Texas whiskey or two, but I think that was my first experience with Texas whiskey, even though it was a single malt. But it kind of reminds me of Balcones, and I know you all partner with Balcones to make this, but it's not a bad thing. I think that it just has that like what I was telling them when you were away for a minute there, Nico, is that I just wrote down that it was super bold, rich, has a little bit of hint of like tobacco or some type of spice on the end. What's the proof on this? Like 119 or something? I haven't tried this.
It's 119.4.
I haven't tried this cut down, but it might take that tobacco note away a little bit, I think. So maybe I'll have to give that a try. Put a couple drops of water in it, but it's really rich and full bodied. And also what was amazing to me, and I don't ever talk about legs, but when I started switching this around the glass, like there weren't any, like it just stayed on the rim. Like it did not move. So, and it kind of matches with that richness that I get on the mouthfeel, plus the color of it. It just looks full. I don't know what better way to explain this. Scott can probably put some better words into motion here, but
I'm gonna pull out my thesaurus here.
Yeah.
When we started the project, basically, after I talked the guys into the idea of doing a blend, the conversation became, well, what do you like? Like, what are you into? What whiskeys? If we're going to try to do something, let's make this what you're into. What are you into? And in the midst of that conversation, we were sort of talking about who else and what are you into and who do you want to work with? And the first one that I brought up was Balcones. And immediately Robert from Iron Roots was kind of like, yeah, totally. They're real. That's a very distinct flavor that you're talking about working with. I'm like, oh, no. I'm very aware of the Balcones funk. And if we use any of their bourbon, it's a very, very, very funky bourbon. It doesn't need to be half Balcones by any means, but like I would like to, if we can incorporate them, that would be fantastic because I really love those guys and I love what they do. And so what we honestly tried to do is we tried to just kind of have just enough of the Balcones funk that if you're familiar with these three distilleries, you can easily pick them out. And if you're not, then it's just, wow, man, there's a lot going on in here. That's really complicated. And I'm like, yeah, well, it's a blend. So yeah, it's going to be inherently complicated. But yeah, I kind of wanted to. When I think of Texas whiskey, I mean, Balcones is one of our. Man, they're the OG, dude. And so, like, if at all possible, I wanted to incorporate them in some way. But I also know that they're very polarizing, and so I knew that it kind of had to be a smaller amount of them. But I definitely wanted them in there, and I'm really glad they made it.
Yeah, I think what stands out to me is the wheat sweetness throughout this. You can tell the corn obviously is different than what I'm traditionally used to drinking, but the wheat for me, this reminds me and drinks a little bit. This is going to sound really funky if you've not tried it, but Hunt and Gather put out a 15-year-old rye whiskey. This has a lot of the characteristics to me of what I got on that. It drinks a little spicy, but it's got like a cream of wheatness to it with like a little cinnamon sugar. Like that is what I get on this. And I think the wheat in this gives it that like more full body, like chewiness is kind of like the consistency that I get versus it being like super smooth or super like rigid. Like it's kind of like thick.
I was just going to say thick.
Yeah.
It's thick.
It's chewy.
Yeah. So that's what I like about it because it is different, but there's some whiskeys that I've drank that I can get some resemblances to, and it doesn't have to be bourbon, right? Because I'm talking about how this relates to a 15-year-old Canadian whiskey.
Yeah.
When we were talking about doing this podcast earlier, I was totally thinking like this could go downhill. I don't know much about Texas whiskey. In full transparency, I hadn't tried it till we got on this podcast, and I was like, what if this is terrible? Like, what if I just don't like it? Because I was thinking it might be light, watery, and I'm just like, this is going to be bad. And it's fortunately that's to the total opposite. Like it's one that I actually really enjoy this. I could drink a whole bottle of this, and it's one of those that like when I first tried it, I first got that like more of that hotter note and that tobacco note. And as you keep on sipping it, because I poured a 2-ounce sample here, and as you continue to sip it, it just continues to get richer and sweeter.
Yep. And
we were just talking about this at a bullet pick that we did a couple of weeks ago, Scott and I. I like those rich, sweet, bold bourbons. He likes all into the corny and everything, but I start to think more of like, tends to get a little bit more watery, a little bit too light for me. And I like more of that just rich mouthfeel that I get out of this one. So kudos to you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of the 7-year-old Lone Elm that I was talking about that looked like motor oil. We had quite a bit of the percentage of Lone Elm was at least 5-6 years old, and so a lot of the color that you're seeing from this is from the wheat whiskey that's a little bit older, that was aged in smaller barrels. It's kind of got the more wood interaction. Yeah, this is. I mean, we just really wanted to make something that was, I don't know, just good. We wanted to make sure that it was good, and we tried really hard, kind of putting together everything that we were into. And I mean, Jonathan Licorice, who's the master distiller and blender at Iron Root, like this is his doing. He's got the magic nose. And when we started talking about what we wanted in there, he just started bringing out all these different samples and these different combinations. And then, the addition of the wheat was kind of the last thing that happened. And so we were going to make a straight bourbon whiskey. But when he brought out the wheat, it was just kind of like, I don't know what it is now. I don't know what we're calling it now, but I do know that this is what we want to go with. And so, yeah, it's different, man. It's chewy. It's the type of thing that I was like, man, if nothing else, I want it to be something that whiskey drinkers are going to go, all right, I don't know what's going on here, but yeah, I'm in. This is interesting. So, yeah.
It would be really fun to put this into a blind and get people's honest feedback and thoughts on it. Unbiased feedback, I guess.
Well, I think it's funny that there's a lot of wheat content in here. Not a lot, but that there's wheat. And I'm thinking it's almost like a high rye bourbon because baking spices are just keep hitting me. Whether it's like
there's so much
cinnamon,
nutmeg in this thing.
play.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
I was just going to, the more I continue to drink it, I think that tobacco maybe actually is more of like a dark mocha type profile, but
I can see that.
So Miko, so you have 3 different blends in here basically, and you said release number 2 will have 4. Use 4 different distilleries.
So what we're doing is we have in October we're coming out with batch 1B, which is going to be the same percentage blend as this one. Obviously, it won't taste exactly the same because it's not the same barrels, but it'll be the same percentage blend as this one. And then batch 2, we are going to be incorporating Still Austin into batch 2. Batch 2 is going to release on March 2nd, which is Texas Independence Day. And then every Texas Independence Day from now on, we will have a batch release. And so we're kind of leaning into that whole thing. We're trying to be all things Texas all the time. So
will your batch 2 be bigger so you don't run out so quick?
Yes. In God willing, we're making 3 times the amount that we've made for the batch 1 and 1B. So yes, we're doing our best to scale if at all possible.
I've heard you mention a couple of times about really trying to make things unique and interesting. So is that going to play into batch 2, 3, and so on? Are you looking for a different profile each time you release a new batch? Or are you trying to stay within a certain realm?
Batch 2 is going to kind of be this vibe. It might be slightly lighter, just a little bit less over the top. Batch 3 and kind of forward, I think that we're gonna, honestly, I think it's gonna be all over the place. I think that I could see batch 3 cutting out all of the wheat and going with the high rye and blending in some rye whiskey, and let's do some sort of a boo rye thing. I think batch 4 could be a malt blend. Like, I think that there's all sorts of different ways to approach this. And so, more than anything is we want Grayson to kind of represent the stuff that's happening in Texas in as best as we can. Mm-hmm. And so, we are, until we change things, we are not distillers, but we are big advocates for the things that are happening down here. And we want to kind of showcase them in this particular way. And so I feel like the best way to get through to a whiskey drinker is to hand them a whiskey that they're into. And that's what we try to do.
Mm-hmm. So you, the casual Texas whiskey drinker, if you were going outside of Texas, which you are carrying that flag and banner very high, by the way, what's your go-to grab?
My brand, yo.
What's your grab if you're going outside of Texas whiskey?
This whole process has gotten me very much into, now I feel like I'm way over the top. Give me the cast strength. I need the the 80-90 proof isn't doing it for me anymore. So as far as stuff from, I don't know, man, I'm really just kind of into interesting flavor profiles and the different ways that people are kind of going about things. Like, I love what Maker's 46 has turned into. That really makes me happy. And the way that they're kind of doing things to kind of individualize like the different barrels, and the way that they're kind of making, they found a way to take a massive amount of whiskey that they did everything possible to make all taste exactly the same, and now they're going to make it taste a bunch of different ways. So that's really great. Like, that's really, really cool.
Yeah.
And so that makes me really happy. I like this. I've kind of got it on my brain because I just came back from Colorado, but man, there's so much cool Colorado stuff. I'm really into single malt right now. Like, I'm really into American single malt and the things that the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission are doing, and like the members of that. I think that some of the best whiskey that's happening in Texas is single malt. And I've never really been a Scotch guy, but American single malt is really kind of my jam right now. Beyond that, like, I don't know, man. I like all of the good things. I had
equal opportunity drinker.
I had Stellum Rye for the first time last night. It was freaking delicious. And it just kind of depends. Like I've thankfully, because of this whole thing, I've gotten really into like the whiskey groups, and I'm sample trading, and I have far too much Texas whiskey and a whole bunch of stuff that people can't try. So I'm able to get cool stuff that, I can kind of trade off, because you can't have this bottle of Balcones because they only made 4 of them, but I have one. So,
Yeah. No, I think you will find 3 of probably the bigger fans of American single malt on this podcast, but we're not the American single malt podcast.
Right.
But
I actually just talked to him. I'm doing an article for American Whiskey Magazine. I talked to Matt the other day because I wanted like his take on American single malt and Texas single malt, and just kind of what he sees kind of coming down the pike.
Yeah. I mean, there's some really cool stuff. Westward. I'm a big fan of High West, High Country single malt. Yep. Locally here, I think one of the better ones I've had is Starlight has some single malt. But yeah, I really enjoy single malts. I think it's really unique. Old Potrero is probably one of my most interesting single malts, and I love the 100% malted rye. I thought that was really a cool take on it.
Yeah, there's a couple down here that are doing some rye malt, which is really kind of cool. There's single malts in Texas, just real quick. Andalusia. If you haven't had Andalusia, it's unbelievable. It's probably my favorite distillery in Texas. Like what they're doing is fan-freaking-tastic. It's all single malt. He's got one triple distilled. He's got one called Striker that's kind of his Texas. So he basically he's barbecuing his whiskey, and so smoking it with a bunch of peach wood, and doing some cherry wood as well, pecan wood. And then we've got I don't know if you can see this. I know this is on the podcast. It's audio, but Real Spirits. Real Spirits is down in Blanco. They make this double barrel, and the Real Spirits double barrel is what they do is they take the regular single malt, and then they do it in a finishing barrel, and it's a whole bunch of different ones. I think this one was finished in a Madeira barrel, but he's got one that was finished in, like, Balcones has this whiskey called Brimstone. Yep. That's scrub oak finished, or I think it's finished. Anyway, he took some Brimstone barrels and he finished his that was his double barrel. It's just fantastic. Like it's some of the coolest like experimental stuff. And he's making hundreds of bottles of it. But if you can find some, it's fantastic. A lot of really, really great single malts coming out of Texas. I'm really, really happy with the direction that's kind of moving. Yeah,
so that could be your all's category that you all hang your hat on moving forward. You never know. Right?
I could totally see that happening. Yeah, I could totally see that happening. We got some weird grain stuff down here. Like we really, really lean into the weird grains. So we'll see. I feel like at some point somebody's gonna nixtamalize some corn and see what that does with whiskey. I feel like somebody's gonna really kind of nail the triticale. Do you know what that is? It's a combination wheat rye hybrid. Really, really interesting. Yeah.
We tried some from Washington, dry fly.
Oh, I butchered
I'm not going to try to pronounce that word. I call it triticale, but
triticale.
Triticale.
Sure.
Nico's smarter than you and I, Scott.
There's a couple of distilleries down here that are making triticale whiskey, which I think is going to be really interesting. And man, it's super experimental. And I mean, I think eventually, 15 years from now, you'll kind of be able to look back and go, oh, that's what Texas is good at.
Mm-hmm.
And
so volume 4 of your book is going to be totally different, right?
100%. Yeah. I feel like I wrote in the introduction was like my favorite thing about writing this book is knowing that I'm going to have to update it in 5 years.
Nice.
So
I think it's very interesting that you guys haven't landed on a category too. I mean, I would think being Texas, it would be corn, and whatever word you used, nixtamalization or whatever that word is. Abba Solo in Mexico is doing that. And they do. That is a wild whiskey.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And I mean, I feel like we're going to end up, Texas is going to lean so far into the corn thing. Like, I think those are the things as far I think the history and lineage of Texas bourbon is going to be weird ass corn. Like, I know that for sure.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So as we close out here tonight, Nico, first of all, we're super appreciative of the sample of the book and the whiskey that you all sent up. Where can people learn more about what Grayson is doing, as well as your book, if they want to find out more about Texas whiskey?
You can go to graysonwhiskey.com. That's our website. We're redoing it right now. It'll be up and running when batch 1B comes out. It's up and running now, but we're just making it better. So we're going to be a little bit more specific with the things that we're doing in there. Ideally, it'll be the type of thing that 5 years from now, when we've got 5 different batches, you'll be able to kind of click into each batch and it'll kind of say, this is how much of this. And I want to be as transparent as humanly possible. Yeah. We have a massive problem with not transparent in Texas. And so I want it to be as transparent as humanly possible. As far as the book goes, texaswhiskeybook.com. That will lead you to a place if you would like the book, and if you would like my signature on it, I'm more than happy to put it on there. More than anything, man, the thing that I would say is if you think you hate Texas whiskey and you haven't had it in the last couple of years, you really should try it again, because the whiskey makers in this state are getting better very quickly. And it always amuses me when somebody's like, oh yeah, man, hey, I got this bottle from Tawakero that's from 3 years ago. And I'm like, oh, have you tried the latest one? Because it's fantastic. I don't know about that one, but they're getting so much better. And the learning curve is just it's crazy down here. And the amount of changes that we have to deal with everybody's kind of always on their toes, but we're finally figuring out how to really make good whiskey. And it's great, man. I would really encourage it. Don't be swayed by a bottle that says TX on it, and don't be swayed by a whiskey that you had 5 years ago from a distillery that you haven't tried in a few years, because the stuff that's coming out now is a hell of a lot better. And man, the stuff that's going to come out in 5 years is going to be even better. And so thankfully we're getting much, much better at making whiskey.
Yeah. I would say definitely, if you have any interest in picking up Texas whiskey, look at this book, because this is kind of the ultimate guide to all the variations, like we talked about, whether it's single malts, corn, rye, wheat, whatever. This kind of goes through, I think it's 35 different distilleries, 4 different regions. It breaks down a lot of that. There's also tasting notes in here. There's cocktail recipes. There's places to go and places to eat. I know Jake likes to talk about places to eat. There's a lot of recommendations in here about barbecue and things like that too.
I mean, so
there's a lot of words in this book, man.
Yeah, if you're looking for a nice coffee table book that you might be able to smack somebody upside the head with, there's like 500 pages in this book with a lot of really
I need
cool
that
pictures.
Next time you're over here.
Yeah. If you can't read, you can still check out this book. Yeah. If you can't read, you can still check out this book, because there's a lot of cool pictures to look at too.
Nice. Yeah, I'm excited. I've been looking at the ebook while we've been doing this podcast tonight. I really like the pictures, because I don't read well. I'm from Kentucky, You
don't speak well.
I don't speak well either. I'm not even going to go what I was going to say with next. But Nico, we appreciate you coming on tonight. It's been a lot of fun just to hear the story about Texas whiskey. And I think it's our job to go explore and try things out. And I think you've given us a reason to go and try. Right. I think that's the most important as an ambassador of the whiskey. That's what you're doing. And we appreciate you sending us a sample that, I believe is really solid. It's a solid, easy drinking whiskey. And that's what I liked about it. So everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. We appreciate you joining us tonight. Please rate us, give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast listening app. You can follow along on our journey on all of our social medias at Bourbon Lens. And if you want to join our Patreon page, you can do so at patreon.com/Bourbon Lens. You can get exclusive tasting opportunities. You can get some Bourbon Lens merchandise, and you get to hang out with Scott, Michael, and myself. That's always fun. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers,
y'all.